Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Remember, every secret has a price. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, we're joined by Ben West, and we take a look at economic espionage, past, present, and future. Ben is a Senior Global Security Analyst from Stratfor, which is a RANE company. On this episode, we take a brief look at the economic espionage activities conducted by the Chinese government. With the recent rise in hate crimes targeting Asian communities in the US, UK, and Europe, I just wanted to add before this interview that no one should discriminate against anyone of Asian appearance because of the actions or perceived actions of the Chinese government. In all honesty, no one should pass any judgment against any stranger based on their ethnic appearance. It really is the height of ignorance to do so, and it should not be tolerated. I say this as I am hyper aware that when discussing espionage, we're typically talking about the actions of one state against another, and it is very easy to otherize people if we're not careful. No individual bears the responsibility of any government, and no individual should be targeted because of the actions of any government. Now, I know all of you would never do such a thing, but I do not know how this podcast is shared and to whom, so even though I probably don't need to say something, I feel like I would be irresponsible if I didn't. So thank you very much, everybody. I just wanted to get that off my chest before this episode begins. I think Ben and I have a fantastic discussion, and I hope you enjoy it. So thank you very much. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thank you.
It's great to have you on. So for the benefit of the listeners, please can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So I am a global security analyst for Stratfor, a RANE company. I've been with Stratfor for about 14 years now. And we cover, as a security analyst, I cover everything ranging from organized criminal activity, terrorism, natural disasters. But I think something that kind of brings it all together is intelligence. That's kind of what we deal in. And so matters of intelligence and as a subset of that, espionage have always been near and dear to my heart, and something that we always come back to, either whether it's in our analysis or briefing clients. The practice of intelligence is just kind of core of what we do.
Yeah, and it's a great, fun enough, I've always found intelligence and looking at it is a great way to kind of understand both history and just the way the world works sometimes.
Yes, and yeah, it's exactly, it's a tool for looking at the past, the present, or in our case, we try to also look into the future and just kind of anticipate what's going to be happening years or decades down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've written a fantastic series of reports for Stratfor on economic espionage from past, present to future. Before we go through your report, I have a couple of sort of broad questions. So first of all, can you kind of give us a definition of what economic espionage is and why you felt it was important to write about this now?
Yeah. So I would distinguish economic espionage from strategic or military espionage. Yep. So I think what most people are probably familiar with is espionage campaigns, spying on a foreign government or a foreign military in order to gain insights into the political machinations or the military maneuvers of a foreign country.
Yeah.
Economic espionage, by contrast, is, as it would suggest, is focused on economic secrets. How is this country exploiting its resources or managing its economy in a way that will help it compete with rival countries? Because I would argue that obviously economic performance is as important to a country's survival and thriving in the world as military or political. And so when it comes to economic espionage, that's also when you start getting more into the realm of private business companies, especially in a place like the United States and Europe. Private companies are the ones that are really driving economic performance. And so this is where espionage, particularly state-backed espionage, starts getting into the territory of private companies and individuals.
Yeah. And maybe a silly question, but also possibly an important one. Why should the average person care about economic espionage? How does it affect us?
Yeah, I think if I were going to bring it down to, really on the individual level, I think people's livelihoods depend on this. If you're working for a company or in an industry or a sector that is being targeted by espionage, I think your livelihood is at risk. If another company or another country can outperform your own company, then that's obviously something you need to be concerned about. On the larger picture, I think economic espionage is important because it ultimately helps countries maneuver in the modern world.
Yeah.
And as we kind of track the rise and fall of various countries over time, economic espionage is at the core of this. And so just, by having situational awareness of your world and who's doing what, I think it's important to watch for economic espionage.
Yeah, and I think I remember from your report, there was something like 320 billion in losses in the year of 2018, based just on Chinese economic espionage activities against the United States. I mean, it's a lot of money being lost to the American economy.
Yeah, I always like to caveat those numbers. Those are numbers put together by U.S. government agencies. I think there's always kind of they're taking the most liberal definition of that. But yes, I mean, we are talking about billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And mostly, I think, lost opportunity. Markets are denied because other companies are stealing secrets and using them to cut into market share.
Yeah, and that's a lot of money away from the economy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that. So let's take a look at the history of economic espionage. In your report, you look at China and Europe and then the United States and the United Kingdom. So can you talk to us about why China was a target of economic espionage in the past?
Yeah, so China, I think it's really important to remember, up until the early 19th century, really was probably, if not one of the most economically dynamic countries in the world. So many things come from China, including, and I mentioned this in the report, tea was originally, comes from China. Silk comes from China. Porcelain, things that we kind of take for granted and don't seem, it doesn't seem that important today. But if you go back several hundred years ago, or in the case of silk, you're looking back to like 6th century of the Common Era. Silk was a huge product, and everyone wanted to get their hands on it, and the Chinese basically had the monopoly on it. It wasn't just you're basically looking at Europe and pre-Middle Ages. Basically, your options for cloth were wool, a very early scratchy form of wool, animal skins or leather, and then some kind of primitive linens. And so silk offered all sorts of different options for just clothing yourself, or for decorations, or for even for military purposes, because silk was just such a strong. It was a much stronger material than anything else that was available at the time. And there were some weaves of silk that could contain a spearhead. If someone were shot by an arrow or a spear, the silk could actually contain the spear, and so it made removal easier. It reduced the likelihood of infection.
Yeah.
It certainly wasn't armor, but it was militarily important. And so that's where we get over the acquisition of the ability to make silk. Sericulture was hugely important then. And, the story of how silk came from China across Central Asia and eventually made its way to Europe. I think that one of the common narratives out there is that, a few monks showed up with some silkworm larvae and gave it to Justinian I of the Byzantine Empire. And then, the European sericulture industry was made. It's a lot more complicated than that. It was a much more gradual process. It migrated, but yeah, that's kind of one of the early cases of industrial espionage was the acquisition of sericulture, of silk technology, about 1,400 years ago.
Yeah. And you made an interesting point in your report about how it's very easy to kind of steal, the technique of making silk, but unless you have like the industry and the skilled workers to kind of back that information up, makes it very hard to kind of replicate silk.
Yes, and I think thank you for bringing that up. That's I think one of the main themes that I saw through looking at the history of industrial espionage is that there's this kind of triangle, the intelligence triangle that we talk about when it comes to espionage, which is intent, interest, and capability. And I think a lot of people focus on the capability as far as the tradecraft of espionage, recruiting sources, acting undercover, clandestine communications, all these kind of things, the technical nitty-gritty of espionage, which are fascinating and a study in their own right. What I think is really interesting to look at too is what do countries do with that? So you have the ability to go get information from abroad, from a rival power, but can you exploit it? And there are many cases in history where you see examples of excellent technical capability of getting secrets, but then ultimately the country that was stealing those secrets can't exploit them. And yeah, so sericulture is a great example of that because it's not just, it's a very complicated process of having the right kind of tree, having the right kind of silkworm, the skilled labor of knowing how to raise the silkworm and extract the cocoon and spin out the silk threads. It's a very complicated process that if you were just handed a few silkworm larvae, that's clearly not enough. And so a lot of things had to be in place. The Byzantines needed lots of skilled labor, access to the mulberry tree. So many things had to be in place for them to stand up their own silk production, not just the insect sample.
One thing that's also in that early section about China was Wedgwood porcelain. I found that really quite funny. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that? Because I found that really funny.
So as an example of countries, maybe having good capability in taking the secrets, but not in exploiting them. And as I'm sure as someone from Great Britain, you'll probably appreciate France's failure on this part. But France actually dispatched a Franciscan friar out to China, basically to study the ways of porcelain making. So once again, China was basically, they had the monopoly on porcelain back in the 18th century. The French said, hey, if we can figure out how to do this, we don't have to buy from the Chinese. We can make it ourselves. So this friar went out. He spent 20 years in China, basically pretty much literally writing the book on how to make porcelain, studied the ins and outs, the process, noted how it was very much an industrial process. There were lots of steps to it, many people involved. And he sent his notes back. They basically sat on a shelf. France was not able to do anything with it. But then about 50 years later, as mid-19th century at this point, Josiah Wedgwood, who had already been working in pottery and kind of dishware in England, he got his hands on this information and was able to exploit it and able to vastly increase the quality of his products based on this information that was collected by, essentially a French spy. So I think that's a great example of, not just having the capability to get the secrets, but to exploit them. And there's a great historian, Robert Finlay, wrote about this, and he makes the point that I think is really interesting, is that maybe one of the reasons why England, an Englishman was able to exploit it rather than the Frenchman, was simply because England was further along in the Industrial Revolution than France was at that point, and it was assembly line process basically, and England was kind of already moving that direction. They already had they were building factories. They were industrializing faster than France, and so England was just in a better position to exploit it than France was. And so I think that's that's a lesson that comes up over and over again, looking at the history of economic espionage, and one that's definitely important to remember when it comes to hearing reports about secrets being stolen, obviously that's concerning. But then we need to look at, okay, what can they do with that? What's the ultimate end game here?
Can you talk to us a little bit about the operations against Great Britain? Because there were some really interesting stories in that.
Yeah. So, I kind of lay out 3 waves of industrial espionage, and they really track pretty closely with just technology transfer in general. And so, China was a major target for hundreds of years. But then as Great Britain industrialized and basically became the manufacturing center of the world by the 19th century, they became the target. And Europeans, continental Europeans, Americans, everyone was going to Great Britain basically to learn from the British on industrializations. And there are accounts of Germans, of Belgians, of Dutch. Everyone was going over there and basically stealing secrets. The British put some pretty draconian limitations, basically saying if you work in a factory, if you have a specific trade that we deem sensitive, you basically can't leave the country. And so I think the United States, though, was in a very unique position because the United States they wanted to industrialize just like anyone else for economic gain. But the United States also had obviously a much more complicated relationship with Great Britain at the time, at the turn of the, going from the 18th into the 19th century. The U.S. had just gained political independence from Great Britain, but they were still very much economically dependent. And basically the way it worked was the U.S. was a source of raw materials, cotton being one of the big ones. They would send raw cotton basically over to Great Britain where it was processed, spun into cloth, and then the cloth was sent back to the U.S. So, the U.S. saw this as a missed opportunity. And so the U.S. decided that, they needed to basically figure out how to process their own raw materials. And so there was a pretty concerted, organized effort that was backed by President Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. There was high level support for basically stealing secrets from the British in order to strengthen the U.S. textile industry, basically to gain economic independence from Great Britain as well as political.
Which was vital to America's kind of survival, really, wasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that was, again, I think these cases are most interesting when it does come down to survival. And I think, looking back at other examples like silk or porcelain, it's hard to argue that those were vital to European survival. They certainly helped. But when you get into cases like the U.S. textile industry, I mean, that's there's a marriage there of strategic and economic interests. And actually, so this, if we can still stay in the past, I think another really fascinating. I didn't actually get to talk about this one as much in my article just because of space, but the story of the British East India Company and tea. I think this is fascinating because it really links economic espionage with geopolitics of the 19th century. So early 19th century, the British had this great system going where they were growing poppies or harvesting opium from South Asia, sending it to China, and then they get tea in exchange for that opium. So actually no money actually changed hands. This was like a kind of an enclosed system. But then British merchants would be able to sell tea for in today's dollars, the equivalent of like $1,000 a pound. So they were doing well for themselves in this tea business. So the Chinese are upset about this because, their population is being basically exposed to high levels of opium. As we all know, it's generally not good for productivity and moral makeup of a society. So the Chinese started pushing back. You had a series of opium wars where the British were basically trying to force the Chinese to continue with this trade. And so in the midst of these opium wars where everything is kind of in jeopardy, the British Horticultural Society sends out a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune out to the hills of China. He's disguised as a Chinese tea merchant, and he collects thousands of samples of the specific variety of tea that the British are consuming. And he actually goes on several trips. He's extremely successful. He's able to basically provide not just samples of the plants, but also he recruits workers. He gets implements. Again, going back to sericulture, it's not just about the product. It's not just about one element. It's the whole industry, right? It's the people who are involved, the tools, the knowledge, and he brings this back to Britain. The British East India Company was already in the process of trying to basically use its interests in India and South Asia to cultivate tea and basically switch the British population from drinking Chinese to Indian tea, with partial success. But now that they had the actual plants, they had the whole operation handed to them. They were able to incorporate those Chinese tea plants in India, and it went a great length in solving this whole dilemma with China, with the Opium Wars, and that they were able to basically create an alternative for their tea demand. And so, I think it's also a fascinating example in not just brilliant tradecraft that this botanist was able to go over and collect all these samples, but then excellent execution, the ability to take these secrets and really maximize the profits and the gains from those secrets by standing up an entire tea industry outside of China.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really interesting one. Yeah, something that really paints an interesting picture. Imagining this botanist in China is quite...
I've had a lot of conversations with people talking about what they were up to, because you're talking about spending years, if not decades, and, all the mistresses and all the things, all the side stories that, that don't really make it out, but are happening. It'd be great to write it'd be fascinating to think of like 19th century British Chinese espionage and like all the other stuff that goes on, not beyond just the stealing of secrets.
Yeah, indeed. It's definitely a show in that somewhere. So thank you very much for talking about the past there. We'll move into the present, part past. Can you talk to us a bit about the Soviet Union and Russia's use of economic espionage?
So as we move into the 20th century, just a quick segue here from the past, I think another important lesson to remember is that despite the fact that China lost its monopoly on silk and porcelain and tea, and the fact that the UK lost monopoly on textiles and kind of industrial manufacturing, China maintained global market dominance in those products up until today. They're still one of the leading producers of tea and silk and porcelain to a degree. The United Kingdom maintained its advantages in textiles for a good 100 years, up until World War I, really. So despite the fact that there was systematic espionage going on, these countries, there were lost opportunities, probably in the millions or if not billions of dollars, but they did fine. They were okay. So as we get into the 20th century, though, that's when the United States really starts to come on the scene, and is kind of the certainly by the end of World War II is the global economic leader, at least. The Soviet Union, I think it's important to remember, was born out of the revolution in the 1920s, and I think there's another argument to be made there that the Soviet Union was engaging in economic espionage for its very survival, because this is a very, Imperial Russia before the Soviet Union was still pretty agrarian. They were definitely kind of at the bottom of the pile when it came to industrialized countries in Europe. They had a lot of catching up to do, basically, if they were going to compete with Western Europe and the United States. And so you see in the 1920s, 1930s, the Soviet Union, I think a famous example is they stood up this kind of commercial interest office in New York, the Amtor Group, and the cover was that it was basically pursuing commercial interests in the United States. It was kind of their commercial outpost.
They had one in London. It had a different name, but the same sort of thing.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. I haven't looked into that one, but that would be interesting to look into. And I know, I don't know the specifics about the London one, but I know, in New York, one of the case studies there is that, they were able to get blueprints for a Ford design tractor, send them back to the Soviet Union. They were unable to make it, even though they had the designs, they had the secrets, but they just didn't have the industrial base built up to produce these tractors, at least not efficiently. And so the Soviet Union ended up actually hiring this industrial designer, industrial architect from Detroit to go over and basically build the factory for them. There was a kind of a coincidence or a benefit of timing here in that they hired this industrial designer to go over. It was around his late 20s, early 30s, Great Depression. He was looking for work. So, I think probably similar to a lot of companies today doing business with China, kind of had to swallow a hard pill there and knowing that, going over to work for the Soviet Union was probably bad for long-term business prospects. But at the time, you take what work you can get during a Great Depression. So he goes over, builds them a factory. Sure enough, they end his contract after the first factory, and they basically took his model and then built off of that to this is kind of getting into, how do you define industrial espionage? He knew what he was giving over to them, but it was forced technological transfer at the very least. And this led to, there was a great article on that, arguing that transfer of the actual factory designs kind of sparked the Soviet industrial manufacturing base, and that it wasn't just tractors, that they used that then to make vehicles and trucks and tanks that they were then able to use to kind of stand their ground in World War II.
Yeah, and help build up their military. Yeah,
right. So this was they saw this as existential. This wasn't just about making a cheaper tractor. This was about ultimately being able to beat the Nazis.
And obviously build up their forces for the Cold War as well after that.
Too.
Yeah, you mentioned the Tupolev Tu-144, the kind of copy of the Concorde.
That one, the Tupolev Tu-144. It was. I don't think there was any ever actual clear evidence that the Soviets were stealing blueprints from the Concorde, but it was definitely an imitation. And I think the consensus seems to be that there was something going on. But I included that too because there's another great example of just because you can replicate the technology doesn't mean that you're going to be successful. Because with it was an Anglo-French cooperation to build the Concorde, they were building it with the intent of it having market success. They were looking at this is the 1960s, 1970s, you had a really strong economic relationship over the Northern Atlantic between the United States or North America and Europe. There was a large demand for going back and forth between the financial capitals of North America and Europe. And so they built the Concorde, it went to market, it was successful for a good 30 years.
Wasn't it?
Before it was finally retired. The Soviets built a plane that was actually faster than the Concorde, and in some ways technologically superior to the Concorde, but they didn't have the market. I mean, this is the Soviet Union. You don't have jet-setting executives flying around making business deals and impressing clients. Things are very centrally. Centrally, it's a central planned economy. Certainly it would help to have a supersonic jet to fly from Moscow to Vladivostok, but there's just not the demand.
No, with a big running cost, and
it's expensive. These tickets are really expensive, and so it flew a few dozen passenger flights, and then was finally retired. So just an example of how just because you can get the trade secrets, just because you can replicate the technology, doesn't mean that you can replicate the market demand to take advantage of that technology.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how similar it was to the Concorde, because I was thinking of another jet as well. The Americans had a jet called the XB-70, and the Russians made something called the Sukhoi T-4. I had to Google it while you were chatting, and they look exactly the same. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think there's some examples. Yeah, the new Chinese fighter jets. There's a tendency there. Yeah, and I think there's certainly imitation going on. At the very least.
A bit of backwards engineering, because he had it with the space shuttle as well, I think, didn't they?
The Buran, the space shuttle, which I don't think actually ever flew.
I don't believe so.
They made it, but then never actually flew it. So, but I think that was coming around like the late 80s, and I think it was more just the fact of the Soviet Union collapsing and sending a shuttle to orbit was just not.
Yeah, no, in the middle of their war in Afghanistan as well, weren't they? So it's like it wasn't a huge priority. Yeah. Well, when the Russian espionage is as big today as it was during the Cold War, and there are some examples you've mentioned about some recent cases involving Yahoo, GE, Boeing, and even Tesla. And one thing that also popped to my mind, there was, and I think it's closed now, but there was an embassy or a Russian facility near Silicon Valley in San Francisco as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. The Russians have kind of used a similar model to mTORG, right? So in Silicon Valley, you had Rusnano, which was this venture capitalist company out in Silicon Valley. There were FBI put out warnings basically saying, hey, they're basically looking to take U.S. technology.
Yeah.
Similar to mTORG, right? And in 2015, I think with Rusnano, there was no actual espionage cases linked directly back to Rusnano, which could just be a testament to good tradecraft on the part of the Russians. But there's another one, a Russian bank financial interests office set up in New York. And one of their employees, it was Russian intelligence using the cover of, having a financial office in New York. And they were, caught stealing secrets, trading secrets from US companies. And that was back in 2015. So I think it's really fascinating to see that parallel, right? That the Russians had their or mTORG back in the 1920s, and here we are, 2015, where they're using a very similar model to you basically set up this kind of commercial financial interest office in New York, and they're using it as cover for espionage. And as you point out, it's not just New York; it's in London. It's probably in pretty much any major financial capital. They're going to be present.
Your report showed a brilliant little small chart that kind of outlines the sectors of priority for both the Russians and the Chinese. Can you just talk to us a little bit about it? Because obviously we can't see the chart.
Yeah, so this is basically identifying priorities of Russian and Chinese intelligence. We made this originally in 2019. We've been updating it, but it's amazing how especially countries like China and Russia are pretty transparent about what their economic development goals are. And China has put out, 5-year plans and their Made in China 2025 initiative, where they basically say straight out, this is what we want to become dominant or at least self-sufficient in. Later, we want to be dominant in. And, these are things, semiconductors are huge. So, the design and manufacturing of microchips, microprocessors, memory, all the things that you need basically to make the processing power of a computer. You've got artificial intelligence. China has invested tremendously in developing their artificial intelligence capabilities in that sector. Maritime equipment, and this links back to, obviously there's a lot of competition between China and the U.S. and its rivals in Southeast Asia, whether it's Taiwan or the Philippines or Vietnam. So having that maritime advantage, that's a place where economic and military intelligence kind of converges, because that's dual use. And then just old-fashioned agriculture. This is still you still have. There are several cases of kind of like your Scottish Robert Fortune out, collecting samples out in the fields. there have been several examples of Chinese scientists and researchers basically essentially out in the cornfields in the United States, collecting samples, basically trying to improve bioengineering and figuring out how to because some of these seeds, some of these foods that are bioengineered, I mean, they're incredibly expensive and incredibly protected information.
Yeah.
And so, trying to basically figure out how the Chinese can replicate that.
Yeah, and you kind of identify China as the clear front runner of 21st century economic espionage efforts in your report.
Yeah, and Russia is obviously highly active in economic espionage, but the reason why I think I would give China the advantage is that, again, both China and Russia are very capable when it comes to stealing secrets. I would give China the edge when it comes to exploiting those secrets. They have, they're investing billions of dollars in building up these industries. They have a very robust recruiting method or recruiting program where they're not only getting the trade secrets, but they're also recruiting the experts to come over to China and implement those secrets. Russia is certainly able to get the secrets. I don't think it's as attractive a place to go work. There aren't the same opportunities there as you have in a place like Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou. So I think China just has the advantage when it comes to making the most out of the secrets that it steals.
That makes a lot of sense. So the US is not the only target of Chinese government economic sort of espionage operations. So what measures can governments take to combat these operations? What challenges do they face? And as China is a huge trading partner for the US and Europe, draconian measures could disrupt that. So is espionage just a cost of doing business with China, do you think?
Yeah, that's the big question that I think a lot of executives are grappling with. So first, I think the fascinating part about economic espionage is that certainly governments are playing a role. Counterintelligence programs are ramping up. Government agencies are trying to find and prevent people from stealing secrets. But it's also, I think it's really important that companies have their own counterintelligence programs, that they are also engaged in looking for this. And that doesn't necessarily mean, adopting that companies need to adopt their own draconian strategies. It can be pretty simple. I mean, thinking about simply, one of the first steps is just figuring out, okay, what are your trade secrets as a company, and labeling those, classifying those as secret, as protected, managing access to those documents, making sure that only authorized people have the ability to access it. And also monitoring, if someone is, I think there's some great examples like in driverless car technology where you had someone who was working on, sensors, maybe they were working on the sensor package. And then, all of a sudden they download 10,000 files on, I don't know, like interoperability and communicating between devices within the car. So when you have kind of unusual activity like that, where someone is kind of going outside their lane, that's a good opportunity to take them aside and just talk to them. There might be a perfectly good reason they were doing that, but if there's not, then you need to pursue that further and investigate. And I think in a lot of these cases, when it comes to industrial espionage, the tradecraft isn't necessarily that good. It's relatively easy to catch. There's just so much of it, and I think especially companies are, I get it. They want to give employees latitude to be independent and do their own thing. Especially, you think about places like Apple or Google. That's kind of their pride. And so really, it really gets to figuring out as a company, how do you maintain that kind of openness and sense of exploration while also protecting your own trade secrets that are worth billions of dollars now and in the future. So I think there are ways to manage it without going back to the 18th century Britain, not allowing craftsmen to leave the country. I don't think we can get away with that today. but just having a smarter approach to it. First of all, being aware, educating your employees about it, letting them know what they can do and be aware of, and I think encourage, reporting of suspicious activity when it does come up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on an individual level, is there anything people can do personally to be more aware of being, of potentially being a target themselves?
Yes. And that's maybe jumping the gun a little bit, but when you get into looking at the future, well, no, I mean, it's the present. It's not just the future. Cyber espionage is a game changer, right? That, we're looking at, I think a great example, it took a Franciscan monk 20 years to steal the information on making porcelain. That can be stolen in a matter of seconds, and you can get a lot more of it and in better quality. I mean, you steal gigabytes worth of information in a matter of seconds now with cyber espionage without ever leaving your country. You don't have to assume all the risks that previous spies have. So when it comes to cyber espionage, yes, I think that does kind of fall on all of us to have good digital hygiene, basically, making sure that that your computers are safe, and whether that means making sure the software you're using is updated, making sure that the software you're loading on your computer is required in the first place. Not having excessive programs and ways for bad guys to get in, basically. Not recycling passwords, making sure that when people reach out to you, that you confirm their identity, and that make sure you're not talking to someone who's trying to exploit you. It really does come onto all of us, because as we've said before, it's the weakest link. That if 99% of your employees are doing everything they need to keep their company safe when it comes to cyber intrusions, all it takes is one employee making a mistake, and they're in. And so it's daunting and overwhelming at times to think about that. But really just thinking about increasing the threshold, making it harder for hostile actors to get into your company is an important thing to think about.
Is there another, with traveling as well, because I've seen many FBI videos about like warning American students or business people to be careful when they go to China. There's one place, there's a particular, I can't remember the name of the video now, but there's a particular video about a guy who mistakenly ends up working, he's a student who ends up working for a Chinese newspaper, which is somehow a front for Chinese intelligence, and somehow gives away state secrets. Are there things people can be careful about when they're going abroad as well?
Yeah, and I say this as someone who, I'm fascinated by China. I myself picked up and moved there and traveled around for several months. So, I think people absolutely should. People should go to China. It's a important place to see and to understand. I can also say, when I was there, I was definitely approached by intelligence, and it's scary how smooth it is.
Was it overt or was it more covert, the way you approached, if you don't mind me asking?
It was, so I was in Beijing. I'd just been accepted to a graduate school program. There happened to be a kind of an alumni event going on in Beijing. I was going it was in a hotel. I was going on my way into the hotel, and this woman just kind of walked up next to me and started talking to me in a very familiar way, and in a way that made me assume that she was also going to this alumni event. And then as we were going in the door, she offered, why don't we just go get some coffee instead? And I thought, wait a second. Like whenever someone's trying to change your action, whenever someone's trying to change the direction you're going in, or do something that you didn't intend to do, that's when you need to be alert. And I realized, this woman was, had nothing to do with the event that I was going to. And, for some reason or another was approaching me. I don't know why, but that's a similar tactic that a state-backed intelligence agency would use. Kind of assuming that level of familiarity and making it seem very natural. And so that's why, you can't necessarily go off of social cues like that, but you can go off of being aware of someone trying to change your behavior or make you do something that you weren't planning to do.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Before we move on from the present, is there anything else that's relevant to you in that sphere, or should we move on to the future?
One more point I would make is that this is another graph that I had included in the report is that the United States has largely defined economic espionage through the Economic Espionage Act of 1996, and that's kind of laid out basically, in law what economic espionage is. If you look at the history of cases going back to 1996, the majority of the cases are actually other U.S. companies, and so I think it's important to realize that this isn't just China and Russia. It's not just this high strategic kind of economic development espionage. This is something that companies do too on a regular basis. That companies steal information from each other, and I think that one thing that one of the criticisms of the United States focus on economic espionage is that people say that it's basically racist, that it's just it's targeting Chinese people. And I think it's important to remember that economic espionage is by no means unique to China. They are extremely active in it right now, but it can be anyone, and it transcends race and national background, ethnicity, and even when it comes to Chinese-backed espionage, China doesn't always use Chinese nationals. There are examples of Europeans, of Americans getting recruited and taking this information. So, not that, just a reminder that racial profiling doesn't help in this case.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. So what does the future hold for economic espionage?
I think that the future, as I mentioned earlier, is very obviously cyber espionage. There's always going to be a place for recruiting sources, recruiting people within a company or in a position of knowledge. So that kind of physical espionage will always be present. But cyber espionage just offers so many opportunities. It's so much lower risk. You can get so much information so much faster. So that it's the present, and it is the future too. And what we try to do in our report is basically lay out, looking at the history of espionage, the present, what are who are some actors that we could anticipate becoming more aggressive collectors of economic espionage in the future. And so, this is looking at countries that some of the characteristics are basically, looking at the makeup of the government. Is it a centralized government where they have a lot of power, a lot of control, where they rely heavily on intelligence agencies and security agencies to govern? Or do those countries have an economic development imperative? So similar to the Soviet Union in the early 20th century, China now, what countries really need to develop economically in order to survive? Those are the countries that are going to pose a threat. Political rivalry is another important factor. Obviously, allies spy on each other. That's been documented over and over again. But countries that are political rivals are more likely to spy on each other. And then finally, intelligence, intent, and capability. What if a country already has a proven track record of conducting espionage when it comes to military or strategic matters? It's a matter of choice if they want to go over after economic secrets too. So based on those categories, we identified a few countries that we think pose a threat in the future. Some of which already pose a threat, but those are Iran, Vietnam, and North Korea. These are all countries that have demonstrated that they can spy on other countries. They're certainly they don't stand to lose a lot of friends. At least when it comes to Iran and North Korea, they've already alienated a lot of countries, so they don't stand to lose any friends by spying on people. I think Vietnam is the interesting one here, where Vietnam is trying to kind of make a place for itself in the world. So it is interesting to me that they have been fairly aggressive in espionage in recent years. They've gone after BMW, Hyundai, and Toyota.
I didn't realize how close Vietnam and North Korea were. I was watching a documentary recently about the assassination of King Jong-il, his brother, and about how North Korea and Vietnam seem to have quite close relations. I was quite surprised by that.
So yeah, you have the whole kind of socialist connection there. Vietnam they've always kind of harbored North Korea. It's one of the few countries where North Korea has an embassy, and they've got these kind of weird North Korean restaurants there that act as ways to funnel money back to North Korea. But yeah, there is I think Vietnam wouldn't necessarily advertise it, but there is something there, more so than with other countries.
Yeah, I mean, their embassy is pretty big there from what I saw, because the one in England is like a small house, whilst the one in Vietnam was like a huge, maybe a 6-story building at least, from the documentary I saw. Yeah. I've not personally been there, but it's like, it looked pretty big with big aerials on top too, which is always a giveaway.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's something going. I haven't, I'll have to check that documentary out. That would be interesting.
Yeah, it's called Assassination. I saw it on Amazon Prime. It's really interesting.
So this is the assassination, that actually had happened in Kuala Lumpur, right? But they were using Vietnam as kind of a conduit.
I believe it was one of the ladies who was kind of caught up, and it was Vietnamese. That's right, and that's where it could have came into play in the documentary. It was really interesting.
Okay.
So sorry, slight sidetrack there, but... But you were saying, so Vietnam's been targeting certain Western sort of brands like BMW and things like that, you were saying?
Yeah, so end of 2019, BMW accused Vietnam of trying to infiltrate their networks. BMW claimed that they were able to stop it, but shortly after, Hyundai and Toyota came out and said that they had seen similar activity, and it was very suspicious timing, because it was around the same time that this Vietnam company Vingroup was standing up its own car making section, VinFast. So there was definitely some reason there. There's some reason for Vietnam to be spying on these car companies, because they were stepping into the fray. They were going to try to start making cars themselves. And so as Vietnam, Vietnam is in an interesting position, because they're trying to kind of take away some of that the low end manufacturing that China has attracted, and so they're also playing a game of catch up. And you could argue that their survival depends on it, because if they can't compete with China, then they're at risk of being kind of dominated by China, and those they're two historic rivals. So yeah, I think with Vietnam, there's a lot of kind of nationalist pride there, as far as kind of being economically independent from China, as well as just a requirement. They have to advance in order to stay independent.
Yeah. One random left field question, if I may. Do you think climate change will bring in new priorities that might come into play for economic espionage?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, basically anything that promotes new technology is going to be a venue for espionage. So there's a great example of Chinese company. I think they were doing wind turbines, and they had a multi-million-dollar contract with this company that was providing a certain part. They basically recruited a company. They recruited an employee of that company for a fraction of the cost, got all the information they needed into the contract, and then they could do it in-house. So there's already examples of China targeting kind of alternative energy companies. And so the more important alternative energy becomes, the more important other technologies in dealing with climate change.
Yeah.
That's going to drive espionage for sure.
Yeah. And the Middle East, I mean, with the decline of oil, I foresee, some countries could really, become bankrupt effectively. Their economy is completely based on oil and stuff. That's quite desperate.
So I didn't include it on the list for future, but I think, countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, these are countries that have a pretty centralized control, government control. They have an established back history in espionage and kind of relying on their intelligence services. And to your point, I mean, their future kind of depends on them diversifying. They're already doing it now, but they need to really be aggressive in diversifying away from energy and figuring out how they're going to survive if oil keeps its low price, or if it, kind of goes out of style.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ben, thank you so much today. Where can listeners sort of find out more about you and your work?
So I'm published on Stratfor.com is a great place to go check out mine and my colleagues' work. Yeah, that would be the place to go.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining me today.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.
If you're struggling with alcohol or drugs, Recovery Centers of America can help. The holidays are over, the new year is here, and the time to act is now. Expert private care at Recovery Centers of America will get you on the road to recovery today. At our award-winning and fully accredited treatment centers on the Eastern Shore and in Southern Maryland, you will be treated with compassion, dignity, and respect by our dedicated team of professionals. You will also benefit from specialized programs, 24-hour medical care, and the comfort of our outstanding facilities. Let us help you. We will answer your call 24/7 and can get you into treatment as soon as today. If outpatient care is right for you, you can receive a same-day assessment and attend therapy in person or virtually. And because we accept most private insurance plans, you get premium care without the premium price. Don't wait. Start your new year. Start your new life today. Call 1-888-RECOVERY now. That's 1-888-RECOVERY.